All right. Thank you all for your patience. And here we are ready to go finally. And we have a few things to talk about tonight. These are incredibly powerful and intense times. And I'm kind of glad to be doing this way just for a change, because sometimes, crisis is the mother of invention, or they say necessity is the mother of invention. And it's nice to know that we can do this. Sam is at SoulFood Coffeehouse, and we are being projected live for anyone who showed up who didn't get the message that I wasn't going to be there tonight, but that occurred, with very short notice. And Gail, editor, partner in crime, is out on the Olympic Peninsula, out that way. And so somehow we're able to do this by the magic of here not being here being all over the place. So I have a few things that I want to talk about this evening. And it's, again, just a really profound time. And there's really three different things that I want to talk about. First of all, I'd like to invite you into my space. This is my home office. Many of you who watch my monthlies might recognize that wall. Let's see, can I point way back there? Because I set up a studio against that wall with a separate computer and a separate table. And that's normally where I broadcast my monthlies from. Those of you who have either seen me on the Astrology podcast or Astrology Hub, or our patrons have probably seen me. This is sitting at my regular desk. And so in a way, it's like, welcome into my home, welcome into my space. It feels a bit more intimate than it does at Soul Food, although there's certainly an excitement and a buzz hanging out with 40 to 80 of you every month. And so that's a bit of a different energy. Yes, it's still daylight here. We're far north, even though the days are getting shorter very, very fast right now. Just, let's see, June, July, August, just a month and a half ago, it was still light at pushing 10 o'clock at night. Now it's only 7 o'clock, and the sun is definitely still out. In fact, what you're seeing through there's bamboo shade, so you're not even seeing the direct light of the sun. You're seeing the shades lit up from the back. Anyhow, and it is warm for Seattle. It's approaching 90 degrees today, and that is not hot for some places on the planet, but it is for Seattle. Okay, with no further ado, first of all, I want to mention up front that we're not going to be doing any charts tonight. We're just going to be doing the discussion of what's going on and kind of this little bit of a download that I've prepared in my mind. I never know what's going to really come out until we begin the process of talking. If you do have questions, though, I do like this to be a bit interactive, and I've asked Sam to interrupt if there's questions from the floor at Soul Food. And if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. If I don't catch them, Gail will catch them and repost them or get them so that they get my attention, because I do want to keep this a bit interactive. There's only about 350 of us here. But again, I really appreciate your guys' participation. Yeah, an intimate discussion, Daryl, in my parlor with 350 people, most of whom I don't know. Welcome. All right. So where to begin? Going back to May and June, looking ahead at July and August, we knew that stuff was going to be going down. For those of you who watched the live broadcast that I did with Steve Judd on April 20th, the night of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, when it was actually exact, the moment it perfected, we were online doing that. And we were talking about some of the things in July and August. And one of the things in particular that we did talk about was the Aquarius full moon on August 19th. and it's something that I drilled down on my August forecast, which was just published yesterday morning, and nearly 25,000 people have already watched that. But if you haven't, well, let me put it this way: if you have, then you know why the 19th of August and that full moon is so important. But we're going to be returning to that a little bit tonight, because it is so important, and it will also be a bit of the focus on my mid-month update for those of you who are $3 a month patrons, and you do get the mid-month update. There'll be a lot more to say on that, because I'm going to try to delay that mid-month right up to the edge of that 19th, only because I'll be real surprised if something important doesn't go on, give or take, several days around that. So basically, there's three things I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about the outer planets, and in particular, I want to talk about the importance of Neptune in a larger scenario, but the importance of Saturn, Uranus, and Jupiter this month. That's one. Number two, several people have asked me to say a bit more about why it's so important to act now. I've said recently that if you're not paying attention to what's going on, and you're not taking responsibility for jumping in however you see the world and however you feel it could be improved, however cosmically you may think and however locally you may act, if you're not doing that now, you may lose the chance to do it. And I want to come back to that and explain why it's so important to pay attention to what's going on now, because we will be losing some of our agency over the year ahead. And it's important to understand that that isn't necessarily a negative thing, as long as we know what's going on now and take action. That's the second thing. And then the third thing is I want to talk again about the week of August 14th through the 19th. So it's really different talking to you guys sitting at my desk and feeling at home versus being on stage with a bunch of people in the room. But it's different. And okay, here we go anyhow. Okay, so I want to start off, and I want to talk a little bit about illusion, because Neptune is the planet that's associated with illusion. And for that matter, it's also associated with disillusionment. It's Neptune, in fact, I always say that Neptune's primary job is to fuzz out the hard edges of Saturn. Remember, for millennia, Saturn was considered to be the limit of perception. There was nothing beyond Saturn. And in fact, even just going back 100 years or so, 100, maybe even 200 years, if you couldn't perceive something with your five senses, with your vision, with your hearing, with your smelling, with your tasting, with your actual touching, if you couldn't perceive something with those, with the five senses, it didn't exist. It was that simple. And it wasn't until first Lavoisier discovering oxygen. That simple. And it wasn't until something's happening here. Sure. Hold on one second. Let me mute this. Just bear with me here a second. Technical stuff here. No, that is muted. I don't know why Sam's coming through. Sam was coming through in a moment. Maybe he will type in the chat box what he was trying to say. Sorry about that. Technical strangeness. So until Lavoisier discovered oxygen, there was not a clue that something could be invisible, meaning not perceivable, and still be real. And when he discovered, Joseph Priestley in England and Lavoisier in France, when they discovered that oxygen was a real thing, it opened up a world that there were things that existed beyond our five senses. And interestingly enough, this corresponded with two astrological events. It was right in the late 1700s. It was right around the time when Pluto was moving into Aquarius. And it was also around the same time that Uranus, the planet associated with Aquarius, was discovered. And of course, Uranus and Aquarius are both planets and signs of the future, the unexpected, that which doesn't fit into what we thought it did. And then in the early 1900s, when we began realizing the existence of subatomic particles like electrons and things that we couldn't even possibly see in any way, and we realized that these things were so important. And we have no problem understanding that something is electronic. These are electronic devices. But if you go back 150 years ago, there was no such thing as an electron. And so the word electronic didn't even exist. Why am I talking about this? Because when Uranus was discovered, the shock of awakening to the fact that there was more than the three-dimensional world that was within the gates of Saturn's five senses perceptions was astounding. It was a shock. And then when Neptune was discovered in the 1800s, in the 19th century, it kind of moved us out beyond in a way that was more gradual. And in a way, Neptune's job is to make the boundaries of Saturn not so real. It's hard to know where real becomes unreal. And then, of course, this was continued through the 20th century with the discovery of Pluto and so many other things that are way beyond our ability to perceive things sensibly. I say sensibly, I mean with the five senses. This is an underlying piece of evolution where we are at a point in history where we are moving from physical to non-physical to metaphysical. And Neptune is a key to this because Neptune is associated with dreams, imagination, and illusion. Now, the reason why this is so important is we have a tendency to dismiss illusion as something that's not real, when the fact of the matter is that illusions are what create the subtle kind of pre-physical scaffolding for Saturn to build reality on. When we dream something, when we imagine something, what we're doing is we're creating a pre-physical reality so that Saturn can lay down what seems to be real after that. And so when we just treat the imagination as something that it's not true, we're actually we're limiting the potential of what can happen around the next bend. And by listening to our imagination and working to manifest it, that becomes an important piece. Now, why we're talking about that right now is that the planet Neptune on its 165-year cycle is at the ultimate, meaning the last degree of the ultimate sign, the last sign of the zodiac, Pisces. When Neptune moves from Pisces to Aries, as when any planet moves from Pisces to Aries, the sun does it every year. It's the beginning of the astrological year. It's the beginning of the cycle of the zodiac. When Neptune does it, it in a way is the beginning of the cycle of dreams, imagination, and creative illusion. So we are at a point where Neptune reached almost 0 degrees of Aries, and then it backed away. It's now retrograde, and it won't move into Aries until next spring and until next year, 2025. And then it's going to kind of go back and forth a little bit, and it won't be until 2026 when it's firmly in Aries, starting the next cycle. So we are at this point of heightened disassociation from reality, kind of being really close to redefining a new reality, especially because as Neptune in 2025 and 2026 move from Pisces into Aries, Saturn coming in right behind it will line up with Neptune, and it will help solidify Pisces. Energy is a bit diffused. Neptune is the planet of diffusion. And when Saturn reaches the actual alignment of its conjunction with Neptune, that will help solidify or concentrate the imagination and precipitate the dreams of illusion into reality. Now, the problem with that is the word disillusion, because when we have an illusion and it becomes real, that is often disillusionment, because things that are real are often not as perfect, not as pretty, not as colorful, not as brilliant as they were when they existed in the realm of illusion. There's nothing wrong with disillusionment. In fact, disillusionment is a powerful statement into making things real. Because when I have a dream that was an illusion and it becomes real, that is disillusionment and creating reality. This is the process that we're in over the next couple of years. And once things solidify into reality, there won't be any more going back in the same way that we have right now in using the imagination to form what will become real. So this is why we're talking about that tricky dance between imagination, dreams, illusion, and reality. It's important to understand that Freud defined illusion as not something that's incorrect, but something that's based upon a wish fulfillment. If I imagine something, I dream it. If I create that in my head, that is an illusion, but dreams can become real. What's the Disney line? A dream is a wish your heart makes, and dreams do come true. So that's, I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because that is a bit of a background of what's going on. And this dance between Neptune and Saturn is so important, because for the month of August, Saturn is in heightened focus. Even though it's already turned retrograde, what's happening is that this month, Saturn is being squared by Jupiter. Now, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction cycle is a 20-year cycle. Every 20 years, Jupiter, taking about 12 years to go around once, catches up to Saturn. And it's almost like every new moon, the sun is in the next sign, because in the time that the moon goes around once, the sun moves 30 degrees into the next sign. By the same token, when Jupiter goes around once, Saturn's almost halfway around again, because it takes Saturn 15 years to go halfway around roughly. And so for that reason, Jupiter catches up with Saturn, almost like the moon catches up with the sun. It's a new moon every time the moon catches up with the sun. Every time Jupiter catches up with Saturn, it's like a new Jupiter to Saturn. And that happened the last time in December of 2020, at the height of the whole COVID quarantine meltdown experience. And in fact, many of you remember that the actual isolation of the virus that was announced and its mortalities that were announced happened within 24 hours of Saturn lining up with Pluto in January of 2020. But it was Jupiter sweeping through that. Every time Jupiter aligned with Pluto and then finally with Saturn, those were key points in that whole process of government control, of quarantine, of vaccinations, whether you think they were a saving grace or a forced government scam. Whatever you think doesn't matter. The fact is that the dates that correspond to that are dates that correspond to the Jupiter-Pluto and the Jupiter-Saturn. And the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in December of 2020 set the tone for the next 20 years. We can go back by decade, and Jupiter and Saturn aligned in 1880, 1900, 1920, 40, 60, 80, and 2020, 2021, actually, but within a year of the even number decades. And so at the odd number decades, that's the fruition, that's the fulfillment. What's happening in August is that the first of 3 Jupiter-Saturn squares occur, and the exact square, the first exact square, occurs on August 19th. And that's the first of 3 exact squares. And what's important to understand is that they continue all the way through. These exact squares continue. We get the second one on Christmas Eve of this year, 2024, and the third one on June 15th of 2025. So what does this mean? This means that regardless of the high frequency events that are being reported in the news and the occurrences and so on, there's a background energy that's happening based upon what began back in 2020, 2021, when Jupiter and Saturn were aligned. Jupiter is expansive, Saturn is contractive. And in a way, the seed that was planted back in 2020, 2021 now is coming to a point of maximum dynamic conflict. Dane Rudhyar called the opening square, which this is, it's the first square after the conjunction in any cycle, as a crisis in action. In other words, during this period of August of 2024 through June of 2025, we are being forced into this crisis of expand or contract. Or more exactly, what is it that we shall allow to continue expanding? And what is it that we need to cut away, that we need to contract and pull in? It's almost like pruning a rose bush so that it can be more healthy. That's what the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction cycle represents. The Jupiter-Saturn square is a point. And it's, when I say a point, it's a point that lasts 9 months, 10 months from August of this year through June, even June, July of next year. This is the point at which the maximum conflict between the growth, the Jupiter, the potential, the expansion, the opportunity, the big picture, the long range thinking, all of that kind of, wow, this is what's possible. And Saturn saying, whoa, don't grow so fast, because like a balloon, if you grow too fast, it'll just pop. We need to contain it. We need to make the growth manageable. We need to hold it in enough, because Saturn wants to return to the past. Saturn wants to maintain the status quo. Saturn wants to rely on what worked. Now, here's the thing, that although Jupiter may be considered progressive and Saturn may be considered conservative, and I don't mean just politically, I mean energetically, either one by itself doesn't work, because without Saturn containing Jupiter, it just explodes, it pops, it fizzes. And without Jupiter pushing up against Saturn, Saturn will collapse inward on itself. And so we are at an absolute balance point, turning point in the big picture that will come to a fruition by 2030 when Jupiter opposes Saturn. And we're not going there tonight, but I just wanted to put that into perspective. So that's the background of why this month, August, is so vitally important. Now, into that, we have to bring the planet of Uranus. Uranus, the planet of shock and surprise. At this point, I'm going to bring up a chart, and let's see if I can do this seamlessly. I am going to share a screen, and I'm going to actually select this page here, and hopefully this will come through. Okay, so we have a chart, and I think you are all seeing this. You all see a chart right now. It's a noon chart for today, August 2nd. Anyway, can someone just in the chat box just let me know that you got a chart on the screen, just so I know that we're good. Yeah, okay. So let me see here if I can make that even bigger temporarily. Yeah, Okay. So I'll put my picture back in this in just a moment. And one other question: can you guys see the arrow that I'm using right now? Is there an arrow right now pointing at Mars and Jupiter? Do you see that arrow? Arrow? Yes, no. You see the chart, but not the arrow. Okay, you can see the arrow. Okay. So
no, we can't see the chart. The arrow. We can.
Okay, I got it, Sam.
No, we can't see the chart.
Okay.
We can see the chart, not the arrow. Okay. I'm sorry.
Okay, now you should be able to see a little crosshair, so that'll be it'll be okay. It's a good substitute for the arrow. Okay, so what we're looking at is a chart for this afternoon, August 2nd, and of course, as many of you know, I always use an Aries rising chart that is not about the horizon, because you guys are all over the globe. And if we use the chart with a midheaven and an ascendant and real houses, then it would be different for everyone. So I'm just showing us right now a chart that has the natural zodiac, which means that wherever you are on the planet right now, actually, when I say right now, I could do this and make this right now. So now this is 7:09 p.m. here in Seattle, but it doesn't matter what time it says on your clock. On your clock, the moon is at 25 degrees of Cancer and 14 minutes. And so this is a chart for everywhere on the planet at this moment in time. What we can see here, and where I want to draw our attention, is, first of all, I just want to note that Neptune is at 29 degrees and 40 minutes of Pisces, meaning it's only 1/3 of a degree, 20 minutes away from being 0 degrees of Aries. But that little RX there means that it's retrograde. So it's not reaching that 0 degrees Aries point, which is why we're so crazy, because we know we're so near such a major change, and yet it's not happening yet. On top of that, Saturn, which is also retrograde, is kind of spreading now away from Neptune, but these two planets will get closer and closer together, and they will conjoin over the next year or two. We'll look at that quickly in just a moment. Well, actually, what we can do here really quickly is, just so that you can see this, is move this ahead a year at a time, and you can see that next year by August, that Saturn and Neptune will both be in Aries, but Saturn will still be a little bit behind Neptune. And if we move that ahead, this is now August of 2025, and we move that ahead, we see Saturn back into Pisces, and then we see Neptune back into Pisces, and then we see them both go direct. And then by March of 2026, I think it's actually late February of 2026, we can see right in there that Saturn moving into Aries then catches up with Neptune. And so this is a key date in all of this, when Saturn and Neptune join up in Aries, but that's not for another year and a half. So let's bring this back to now. And let me point out one other thing, and that is that the role of Uranus in what's going on these days is absolutely important and significant. In fact, if we go back to July, and let's go back here to July 13th, 14th, 15th. July 15th was the opening day of the Republican National Convention. And within a couple of days of that, pretty much every astrologer on the planet who is paying attention said that something unexpected would be occurring that day. And I think in my July forecast, the words that I used is that Mars is assertive, aggressive, often violent, and that Uranus is unexpected, and that together they can be explosive. I think Mars-Uranus is kind of like the Tower card in the Tarot a bit. And I'm going to actually put my picture back on here so that, yeah, there I am. And I think here it's significant to note that this was within, obviously, just a couple of days on July 13th, with Mars only 1 degree away from its conjunction to Uranus, was when the attempted assassination occurred, and that whole event and the stuff that came out of it. So we're looking at any planets that are conjoined or square to Uranus as being important in this picture here. Mars is conjoined with Uranus. Now, as we move this ahead, I'm going to just jump this forward here a week at a time, so that we can actually get to, that's a little bit too far. And let me come back here to July 21st. And now we can see that Mars is moving away from the conjunction to Uranus, and Mars has just entered Gemini. But what we need to know is that Mars moves faster than Jupiter, and throughout August, and by August 14th, Mars will catch up with Jupiter. We're going to watch that in just a moment, because remember, Mars is an activator. Mars is hot. Mars is angry. Mars wants to define boundaries, which can be a very important thing. But if it does it impulsively or too impulsively, it often can get itself into trouble, because Mars doesn't have to be violent. Mars can simply be passionate and assertive. And the line between assertive and aggressive is one that we always need to be careful of when Mars is active. So we look at July 21st, and we can see that Mercury at 26 degrees of Leo is squaring Uranus at 26 degrees of Taurus. This was the day, and actually, well, first of all, this was the day that Joe Biden made his announcement, made his formal speech that he was not going to pursue, that he was declining the nomination for the Democratic presidency. And it was also within a couple of days, just before that, with the CrowdStrike internet meltdown that apparently has cost nearly $1 billion. Delta Airlines alone is claiming a $500 million loss from that internet shutdown, which in some ways is, I think, a reminder of how fast everything can change, whether it's by a government-imposed quarantine, or whether it's by a technologically imposed inability to communicate in manners that we are so accustomed to using the internet. But the suddenness of what happened in that period of time when Mercury squared Uranus is just another important thing to note here. And incidentally, it's important also to understand that that was also the day of a full moon. If we just move this ahead a few hours at a time, we can see that when the moon moved into Aquarius just before that, it was exactly full on the morning of July 21st. And then the moon caught up with Pluto, powerful, intense. And then it made a trine with Mars, and all of this is feeding the fact that Mercury was squaring Uranus. Why are we talking about all of this? Well, it's because when we look at the chart for today, for right now, we can see that in the sky today, if we go back just a few hours, we can see that Venus was making an exact square with Uranus. Whoop, went a little bit too far, a little bit too fast there. Venus was making an exact square with Uranus right there at about 7 o'clock this morning. But Venus square Uranus is very different than Mercury or Mars squaring Uranus or conjoining Uranus, because Venus squaring Uranus is basically saying what we want, what we like, is different than what we had. There's this attraction, there's this desire for something new. But here's the important thing. The important thing to note is that Mercury will be turning retrograde over the next couple of days, that in fact Mercury is already slowing down. We can see here Mercury at 3 degrees, almost 4 degrees of Virgo, turns retrograde on August 4th. And as it begins backing up, it's going to, we can see here now it's back to 3 degrees. And just watching that Mercury, we can see that, oops, sorry again, that thing ran away with me. Oh, hold on one second. Hold on one second. Let me just get readjusted here. All right, here we are. Sorry for all the movement on the chart. So here we have Mercury. That, let me go back to where we are now. All right, we've lost the plot. Okay. All right, so what we have is Mercury over the next days. Mercury turns retrograde, and then by August 13th, Mercury backs up into Leo, and by August 17th, 18th, right in there, Mercury makes a square with Uranus again. This again is some sort of sudden, unexpected breakthrough announcement, something in communication, something to do with how we communicate. Remember, before it was an internet meltdown and a change at the very, very top of the Democratic ticket. But there's something else here that is incredibly important, and that is that at this exact same time, we have the moon in Aquarius moving into the position of being a full moon, which occurs right around noon. It's actually at 11:35 a.m. I think we can actually get this exact. Yeah, right there. It's about 11:25. Sorry, 11:25 a.m. Pacific time. The moon is opposite the sun. Mercury retrograde has just aligned with the sun, a cazimi. It's in the heart of the sun, intensifying the power of Mercury. And remember, at this point in time, Mercury is still tightly square to Uranus, and the sun and the moon, the full moon, at the moment of it being full, is only 4 minutes of arc square to Uranus. Uranus at 27 degrees, 11 minutes. The moon and the sun at 27:15, that's 4 minutes of arc. That's 1/15 of a degree. This is Uranus back in the picture again. Uranus, the planet of shock, surprise, of breakthrough, of ingenuity, of brilliance. Uranus by itself is neither good nor bad. It just releases pent-up tension in a way that sometimes feels overwhelming, but then we actually get to deal with the energy and somehow assimilate it if and when we can. And yes, Ken asked if there's an indication of an electrical outage or internet mishap again. Yes, that is all the square to Uranus, because Mercury squaring Uranus here, this doesn't mean it will happen. And in fact, this doesn't mean anything will happen. It's just setting up the heightened potential for it. But we'll say more about this in just a moment. But here we have, at this moment in time, we have the full moon square Uranus, but we have something else happening at this same moment in time. And that is, remember, I started out talking about the importance of the Jupiter squaring Saturn all month. And here we have, at this exact same period of time, we have Jupiter squaring Saturn. And I'm going to here just highlight this so you can see this a little bit clearer. Just bear with me here 1 second so that you can see this really clearly. What we're going to do is simply show the Jupiter, Mars, Saturn. Jupiter, Mars, and Saturn. And we can see how close the Jupiter-Mars is. And remember, it was Mars conjuncting Uranus that was the suddenness of what happened at the Republican National Convention within a few days of that. Here, we have Mars again heightened, because if we back this up just a couple of days to the, it's actually exact on the 14th, we can see that on the 14th, Mars and Jupiter are exactly aligned, but they're aligned within a half a degree of their square to Saturn. And by the 19th, the day of the actual full moon, we can see that Jupiter is exactly 1726 to 1728. That's within a couple of minutes, 1/30th of a degree at the moment of the full moon itself. On top of that, we add to this the fact that, hold on one more second, and we want to add one more planet into this, and we want to add Venus into this, and we add Venus into this, and we see that on the 18th and 19th, that Venus is coming through that same point where Venus on the 18th is at 16 degrees, almost 17. By the 19th, it's at 18 degrees. And by the 20th and 21st, it is squaring the Mars at 20 degrees. And so this period of time here has this heightened energy of what? It has this heightened energy of the expansion of Jupiter being energized by the force of Mars, being restrained or restricted or held back in some way by the walls, boundaries of Saturn, and Venus in here being squared by the Mars and Jupiter and opposed by Saturn. It doesn't feel good. There's something here about what we like and what we're not getting yet. And that's basically adding to all of this pent-up tension. Now, let's just set that aside for just a moment and come back to this same chart. But now let's look at just the fact that the full moon, remember, the full moon is the moon opposite Sun and Uranus. And at the exact same moment, the chart hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed here is what aspects we're looking at. And now at the same moment, we can see a T-square again. This one, instead of being aimed at Jupiter and Mars, saying overdoing, overamping, and Gemini adapting and just kind of reacting. Now we're looking at that Uranus and Taurus, which is about unpredictable change, but Uranus and Taurus doesn't like to change. That's why the changes are so profound and powerful when they happen, because Uranus is the planet of lightning striking, and yet in Taurus, it holds back, it builds the charge up until it's so great that when it strikes, something happens. And so here we have Uranus at the point of that T-square, and that means that Uranus, the lightning striking, the suddenness, is what's going to resolve this communication that's squaring Uranus, lined up with the Sun and opposing the Moon in Aquarius. The Moon in Aquarius, in some ways, is referring back to Pluto, still in Aquarius, but heading back into Capricorn for election day. I mean, this moves back into Pluto moves back into Capricorn in September and stays there until December, almost as if we have a little quick remedial course in the taking down of the structures that Pluto in Capricorn seemed to be responsible for on some level. But this is why this day is so extraordinary. Now, I'm going to bring back into this picture both T-squares so we can see how extraordinary this day is. And I'm going to add here the Jupiter and Mars and Saturn and Venus. And now we can see together those two incredibly potent T-squares that are all almost exact. I mean, you know, the full moon square to Uranus is not just partile, meaning same degree, 27 degrees Aquarius, 27 degrees Aquarius moon, 27 degrees Leo sun, 27 degrees Taurus Uranus, but they're 4 minutes of arc, 1/15 of a degree of being away from each other. And then the squares, Venus actually is very closely square the midpoint, the halfway point between that Jupiter and Mars. So it's like it brings them both in. And of course, Mars and Jupiter are still squaring Saturn. We didn't talk about the Mars squaring Saturn separately, because if we go back just a couple of days, we can see the Mars here at 17 degrees of Gemini squaring Saturn. The rest of the stuff isn't there, but this is in fact in play this whole week. Mars, hot, fast, gas pedal, accelerate, do it. Saturn, brake, don't, hold back. And so this is about the frustration that's being fed by this expansive Jupiter. It's just an extraordinary period of time. And now I'm going to take all the aspect lines that I had kind of hidden and bring it back to the regular chart, and we will go on and talk about one other thing. And so hold on one second, and now we should have the whole sequence of everything here and why the 19th is so important. There's a lot more going on, and in the August forecast, I do drill down on this a bit more. But my point here is not looking at all the nuances of this. It's trying to start. I looked at the chat box and someone said that their kid was starting school that day. And so I saw start and I said, it's about starting. No, I meant it's about understanding the larger picture of what's going on. And there's a lot of other both stress and release going on that's very important. This is not all bad news. In fact, it may not be any bad news. Everything that happens is good news and bad news, although some things seem like terrible cataclysmic things. You know, I always go back to, like the tsunami, the Christmas full moon tsunami back in 2000, whatever the year was, that killed, I don't know, a few 100,000 people in Indonesia. And I'm not making light of that when I say that it killed a few 100,000 people. It was a severe event, and it was a real tidal wave. Now, although it was a horrific event for those people, for the people who lived in that area, and certainly for humanity, it may have been a whole lot worse if the Earth didn't release the tension through that tidal wave and held on to it, and maybe a year or 5 or 10 years later released it through such an earthquake that it took out half the planet. I mean, those kinds of transitions are possible, and often it's the sudden releasing of energy that only builds up if it doesn't release gradually. So for anyone who has a T-square in their chart, I do, historically, a T-square is considered to be, in ancient astrology, difficult. Often they're considered to be afflictions because they're conflict. But without conflict, we often are lazy and we don't do anything. And so this is why I come back to the point that I was making at the very beginning about this month being a turning point. What happened back in April, matter of fact, at the conjunction of Mars and Uranus back on April 20th. That was within a couple of days, give or take either side, when the United States student community in particular, although all over the world, was in demonstration meltdown over what's happening in Gaza, and brought that to the attention of people who didn't want to know about it. And in fact, although many people and much of the status quo has isolated those people who are protesting, whether they were students at Columbia or UCLA or people on the streets in major cities all over the world, labeled them as radicals and rebellious and people that were terrorists and so on. There are many people who have dug into the facts and see everything from a slightly different point of view. Now, my goal here is not to inflame anything. My goal here is simply to talk about how the astrology reflects that's going on. And it's very important to understand that at that moment of the Mars-Uranus conjunction, which was the first time that Mars and Uranus aligned since Pluto was back in Aquarius, since Pluto was in Aquarius at the time of the French Revolution, and within a week of that revolution, the height of it or the turning point was Bastille Day, which was actually within a week of the Mars-Uranus conjunction when Pluto was last in Aquarius. And that obviously, that event at that day, that week, that month was a big event if you were around, but no one had an idea at that time of how important that would become over the ensuing weeks, months, years, decades, even centuries. So I'm suggesting that what was going on back around April 20th, when Mars was aligned with Uranus, let's just take a quick jump back here to April 20th, 24. And we can see here, I didn't mean Mars, I meant Jupiter. Jupiter was aligned with Uranus back there. And what was going on then was incredibly potent, and in many ways, I think, is setting the stage for the full moon and Mercury squaring Uranus that is going to be occurring on August 19th. And so this is the larger, the larger sweep of things that I think is really important to understand. Let's go back here to noon is close enough. Because events in astrology do not happen in isolation. Many astrologers look at a day coming up, a week, a month. I mean, I did this for years when I wrote a daily horoscope column. We tend to look at what's happening that day. And it's often, we don't have the time or the inclination to look at, okay, here's what's happening on this day. But what does that mean in the wider scope of things that are unfolding? And I think here it's important to see that this is unfolding in a larger scope. I don't know what will happen on August 19th. Maybe nothing. It's possible, because astrology is not, like the cosmos is not. Astrology is not mechanical. There's an organic factor to it. There's a hum like music, that different notes can come in. We can hear different things. And so from that standpoint, what is going to happen on August 19th, give or take, I would say even a week, because this is really an opening for things to happen. Because it is the first day of the Democratic National Convention, one might imagine that there might be some either something happening that is very forceful and expressive around then. Does it have to be violent? No, but it is Mars, Jupiter, and it is a Uranus square. It strikes me that there probably won't be a fight over the Democratic National nomination, the Democratic Party nomination for president, because it seems that Kamala Harris has that locked up. And yet the question becomes, what might explode at that point in time, if anything? And my bet is on, and of course, some of this is from an astrological standpoint, but let's face it, a good astrologer doesn't just look at the planets, they look at the flow of events. And from that standpoint, I can't help but think that the crisis of what's happening, that I believe is part of a much larger scenario that will play out not only over the next years ahead, but over the next decades, which is hard to kind of imagine. And that has to do with a global change about the perception of corporatism, colonialism, imperialism on the planet in general. And I think that we may see some of this coming to a crisis or a head around the time of the Democratic National Convention. Obviously, we are at such a delicate point in history right now that this could be one of many things. I mean, we have kind of things to a maximum tension, pulled to a maximum tension, between, well, let's just say in the Mideast, but between the state of Israel, which is really not the state of Israel, it's the state of the United States, England, Israel, and other colonial interests. And I'm not judging, I'm not judging them, but I am judging the interests. Delicate territory, I know. But the conflict between that and the Hamas and or Gaza and or the people of Palestine, or any indigenous people for that matter, whether those are indigenous peoples of Venezuela or Sudan or Ukraine or Taiwan or the United States or Canada. It's obviously a more complex issue, and it's one that we are even seeing on the national political scene now in the United States about the breaking down, we're back to Neptune, breaking down of what used to be hard edges of Saturn, even between ethnicity, origins, having a Democratic national a Democratic candidate for presidency who is basically bi-ethnic, meaning a Jamaican father and an East Indian mother, that some people just resist and can't wrap their minds around. Anyhow, enough said there, but I do think that this is a huge turning point. I also want to, before we leave this, I also just want to take us up toward the end of the month, because as we move toward the end of the month, we're beginning to get a taste of why I think this turning point is so important. It begins to come in around the 25th. And you can see here on the 25th that the patterns of the blue energies begin to come more predominant, that going back to the 19th, we see the red energies, the squares and the oppositions, even the orange, the half squares and squares and a half, the greens, the quincunxes, which are the adjustments, irritations, the discomfort. But by the time we get to around the 21st, even we get an inkling, but around the 24th, 25th, we begin to see the red lines begin to fade. And we begin to see the blue lines coming in stronger and stronger. And this, in fact, I think shows how we'll be able to move from a conflict into some place of comfort. Now, again, my comfort isn't necessarily your comfort. And this is an important thing to understand, that in any given situation where there is conflict, there are, in fact, winners and losers, although there are some conflicts where there is an awareness that enables us to take what would be a winner and loser and turns everyone into, at a higher level, someone who can integrate a larger picture. I believe that's where we are heading, whether you individually or I individually like it or not. Here on the 28th, we can see that Venus is at a point where it's moving through or moved through a trine, first to Uranus. We could back this up a day or two and see that Venus at 27 degrees of Virgo, trining Uranus at 27 Taurus, and coming into a trine with Pluto, which is just barely ready to change signs as it's going to back into Capricorn, and that Venus exact trine to Pluto occurs on the 29th. And incidentally, if we continue this just a few days ahead more, we can see that on September 2nd, Pluto backs into Capricorn. But coming back here, we can also see something else. And we can see that Uranus is also getting closer and closer to a trine to Pluto. And they're both making trines to Neptune. But this whole pattern is not quite exact because Uranus is moving faster than Neptune and it's moving into Gemini. It'll get there next year. And we already talked about how Saturn and Neptune are both moving into Aries, where they will exactly sextile Pluto. And so this pattern that we're seeing here of this grand trine moving from practical Earth, Uranus in Earth Taurus, and Venus in Earth Virgo, moving as Venus moves from Earth Virgo and then opposes Neptune, a little bit of disillusionment, a little bit of projecting fantasy. In fact, this is actually a kite where you have a grand trine with Neptune at the opposition to one point on that trine. It looks like a kite if you just look at those blue lines and nothing else. But as Venus moves into air sign Libra, then it picks up on the exactness of that trine to Pluto by the end of the month. Now, if we were to move this ahead, really just for a moment to, let's just go July 1st of 26, and move this ahead a couple of days. I just want to show you something here, because right around this period of time, we're going to get a chart that you will be seeing a lot of from a lot of other astrologers over time. It's actually on July 19th. It's actually a little bit earlier in the day, but it's not just about this moment. It's about this period of time, because on July 19th, we can see that the moon moving into Libra, which is where Venus is moving right now. By then, Pluto will be at 4 degrees of Aquarius. Neptune will be at 4 degrees of Aries. Uranus will be at 4 degrees of Gemini, and Jupiter will be at 4 degrees of Leo. I have to say that in all my years of astrology and in all of my historic searching backwards and forwards, I've never seen a chart like this. And if anyone else does or can, would you please note that for me, because I'd be totally interested in that. The idea of having such a solidification, you see, trines and sextiles are energy that flows without resistance. Forget about good or bad. The energy flows. When you have squares, the energy is maximum disruption. And right now we're getting those squares. But by July of 2019, we have the four of the 5 outermost planets are all in trines or sextiles with one another. You know, the Uranus conjunct Pluto was the craziness of the 1960s, and the Uranus square Pluto was the craziness of the 2010 through 2015. You know, the Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring and just everything that happened during that period of time, the resurrection or the completion of legalization of gay marriage. I mean, there were just so many things that happened during that period of time. During this same period of time, Jupiter will be trining Neptune, and between them, there's this smooth flow of energy. And actually, I wasn't going to do this, but just to point this out, just so that you can see this, I'm just going to take for a moment here and go to the outer planets here. So we show Jupiter, Uranus, Pluto, and Neptune. And we can see there how the energy here is all interlacing with trines and sextiles. And I think that we will be in a point here where we will not have as much agency. Whatever it is that is in process then, it doesn't mean we won't be able to impact anything. It just means the outer structures will be on a path that will be as it is. And there will be winners and losers on every individual bifurcation, whether it's issues like, medical sovereignty, vaccination, whether it's on issues of personal sovereignty, abortion, and right to control your body if you're a woman, whether it's on issues of racial supremacy or systemic racism, or whether it's on issues of right to alter one's consciousness, or the right to have whatever type of relationships that one has, without regard to the state saying that you have to have intimate relationships in this setting versus that set. I mean, the issues are many. All I'm saying is that on individual issues, there may be people who feel like they won or lost. But on the larger flow of civilization in itself, I think things will be set in stone, or at least set in enough stone that we'll live with it for a few years. And that's why it's so important that if you're kind of saying, oh, I'm going to sit out this presidential election and not vote because I don't want to vote for the lesser of two evils, or whatever, this is not a time to be quiet. It's not a time to be silent. It doesn't mean that we should act on impulsive over assertion, because that in some ways is just as dangerous as anything else. Let me go back to get rid of these charts now here, just temporarily, and stop screen share, and we're back here. This is not to say that one should just go all out and be crazy, because being crazy can make us feel better in the moment when we do something that we're emotionally charged or driven to do. We need to pay attention to what's happening hour by hour, day by day, week by week, and we need to keep one eye on that distant future. If you're an American citizen, you need to think about the Supreme Court 20 years down the road, not about whatever your primary driving issue is on a personal level. Not that that's not important. You see, here's where politics does make strange bedfellows. And that is that we all have to kind of grow up and figure out what we need to do to get on a trajectory that is going to be movable, rather than a trajectory that'll just melt down and basically not be movable in a direction that we want to go at all. And Simon, whether you live in the United States or not, this same issue is happening all over the planet. It's happening right now, big time in the UK. It's happening big time in France, in Hungary, in Poland, in Venezuela, in the Sudan, in Ukraine. I mean, it's in Australia. It doesn't matter where in the planet you are, where on the planet you are. These larger events will eventually find you. Remember, in this quantum age of electronic and digital instantaneous communication, what we used to think is here is no longer here. Here now is planet Earth. It's humanity. And although you may be an anti-globalist because some of the globalist issues that you see are horrific for you as an individual, and I understand that and I support that. This in a way, the practice of Pluto moving into Aquarius, got 20 years of that ahead of us, is basically thinking globally, cosmically, but globally and locally at the same time. One can be an Indian and a Black simultaneously. One can be, a this and a that simultaneously. And we have to, in some way, open our awareness. This is what a full moon does. Any opposition forces us to see two sides of a tug of war. And when we don't, we look at one side, the other side becomes invisible. That's what gets projected, and that becomes our enemy or our nemesis. That's the basic geometric structure of why oppositions and squares are so important. what we need to do is we need to be able to expand our awareness so that even if we feel strongly about one side of an issue, we can at least understand both sides so we can work with the opposition rather than going into denial about whatever the other side is. Anyhow, that's enough. I mean, this has been, like I said, you're in my home, so you get a more personal rant. Oh, by the way, there's one other thing I wanted to discuss. And that is something that comes up every year, and it's the concept of the Lion's Gate. You know, there is a deep issue here about the transition or again, another bifurcation in astrology between tropical and sidereal astrology, where the stars are and where, and where the seasons fall. And Lionsgate seems to be related historically to the fixed star Sirius and the flooding of the Nile. And there are many people who put a lot of emphasis on the concept of Lionsgate. This is not an astrological tradition. This is kind of a new concept that's been laid over astrology. If it's important to you, I certainly support you in your study and your observation. It's not something that I pay a huge amount of attention to. And that's just me. I'm not dismissing it, because there's so many things in astrology that are potentially important that we focus on what we focus on. And, I have my own particular pet interests. For those of you who study with me, you know that I'm particularly interested in planets as waves, not particles. You get some of that here. The particle wave duality at the quantum physics level is reflected in the macrocosmic level. And so I'm always looking at the repetitive patterns. I'm particularly interested in harmonics and harmonic astrology and harmonic aspects, quintiles, septiles, etc. But I certainly have a huge amount of respect for traditions and for practices that I don't particularly use. But there are other people who can speak about them in ways that might reflect better. I'm kind of laughing because I see Amanda's thing. Chris Brennan last year said Lionsgate portal shifted to where did it go? To Leo's butthole, because basically there is a precession of the equinox. If you're interested in Lionsgate, Google it. There's a lot of information on it. Again, just because I don't use it doesn't make any less of it. There are a lot of things in astrology that you might use that work for you. There's a lot of things in astrology that I might use that work for you that you'll never use, and that's okay. The universe kind of, the cosmos conforms to the way of thinking. One of the things that I love to impress upon others, especially my long-term students and those in my apprentice program and so on, is that there are not 12 signs up there. There's 12 signs in here. And I didn't get that because I'm so clever. I basically got that from Johannes Kepler, who was really clever and basically figured out the mathematics of how planets move and introduced the non-Ptolemaic aspects like semi-squares and quintiles and so on. But we use 12 because it's a really useful number. But there aren't 12 signs up there. We patterned them so that we can interpret them. And there's lots of ways of patterning the universe. And if Lionsgate is one of the ways that you pattern the universe, albeit, bless you, have fun. And that's all I'm going to say about that. All right. I think we've come to an end here. If there's any questions, however, I am happy to respond to a question or two. Someone said something about algol, and I have some teachings on algol, but algol is known as the beheaded Medusa and the star of decapitation. And of course, it's interesting and I think expositive that the Mars-Uranus conjunction that correlated with the assassination attempt of Donald Trump was while that conjunction was conjunct the fixed star Algol, it is the star of decapitation, and the wound that that Donald Trump received, whether it was a bullet or, as the Secret Service seems to think, a fragment of something, whether it was a flying piece of glass or something, we don't know. And whoever thinks they know right now doesn't know, but I don't know. But it was still a wound to the head, and Algol is the star of decapitation. So yeah, that's it. That's enough. I'm going to check the chat box here and see if there's anything else that I need to address. Oh, and by the way, just for the record, next month I will be in England. I'll be speaking at the Astrology Association, the Astrological Association annual conference in the UK. And so I will not be at Soul Food. It remains to be seen. If you guys like this, let me know. I could possibly do another live event from England on the night that I would normally do this. That's up to you guys. I'd be happy to. I think it would be 2 a.m. though for me, which I wouldn't mind. But we're leaving that open. I will be back in physical form at Soul Food in October and November. So I will see you all who are local then. And that's it. Let me just check and see if there's any other questions. Gail, am I missing anything? Are there anything here that Gail has reminded me, what do I think of all the planets changing signs all at once? Well, that's part of that picture that I had up just a couple minutes ago. The fact that Jupiter changes signs every year, but Saturn and Neptune and Uranus and Pluto, the four outer planets, all changing signs and all changing from yin to yang polarity signs. Pluto changing from earth to air, Neptune from water to fire, Uranus from earth to air, and Saturn from water to fire. This is a huge shift, but it's another piece of why we're in such a dynamic point of change right now, because we're at the ultimate mutable or changeable or adaptable point before 4 of the 5 outermost planets, or in fact, the 4 most outermost planets, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, are all in this kind of place of change. So it's very, very important. And that question was from Lisa. Thank you, Gail. I'm okay. And and I think that's all. The audio connection. Someone says that there was something disconnected, but I think we're reconnected now. Sam was trying to make his microphone work. We're still trying to get this remote thing of 3 different places worked out. But that's it, unless anyone has anything else that they want to bring up. That would be great. Thank you, Gail. And thank you, Sam, for both of you for your help. And thank you all for your comments. There's too many for me to respond. They're going by. There's about 600 people here. And so I'm just so pleased to see so many of you online. And I see some familiar faces. Well, familiar faces. I see some apprentices. I see Jane, who's an apprentice. And there's just too many people, just so many of you. Thank you all for supporting me. By the way, I would also recommend that if you go to patreon.com/Rick Levine, if you don't get my mid-month update, that's available for $3 a month. And there are other levels of participation, including monthly chart interpretation, and so on. Patreon.com/Rick Levine. Also, if you're not on my emailing list, That's simply www.ricklevineastrologer.com. Feel free to jump on that and get on the mailing list. I will not overwhelm you with marketing stuff, but at least that way you'll be included if something important happens. And other than that, Sandy wants to know if there's a possibility of an earthquake in Cascadia, which is where I live, and tsunami on August 19th. There's always possibilities of an earthquake here. And yeah, it's a dynamic day. I mean, whether it's, earthquake, volcano, sudden political event, economic event, I don't know. I would like to think that I was a prophet, but I do not have foreknowledge. I do know where the planets are, and I do know what happened when they were there before. But again, the universe, just like us, is not mechanical. There's this whole infringement or influence of organic motion into the universe, and that we can impact and influence the future by either holding or processing or working with or learning yoga. I mean, I don't mean sitting in postures, although that too. Yoga is basically comes from the yoke of the oxen. Is you put a couple of ox together, and how do you manage that energy? By the yoke of the oxen, it basically is ways of limiting the energy and bringing it to some place of concentration and forward movement, so that yoga can be a mental yoga, a jhana yoga. It can be a yoga of what you do, a karmic yoga. There's many types of yoga. And I think that what is important here is that we understand that as we do what we can locally, again, the smallest events, the smallest behaviors and actions build as they create resonance in our own lives that build and build and build. We don't change the whole by simply disrupting it and making it go somewhere else. We change the whole by making little changes that create drag, that bring around, the big rudder on the big ship of state, as Bucky Fuller would say. So anyhow, that's it. Yeah, someone said, yeah, Mother Earth is sentient. Show some love. And I'll leave you with that. And again, thank you all for showing up. And I appreciate your support. And I'm going to say, as I always do, think cosmically, think really cosmically, push your mind out to the edges, but don't leave it there. Bring it back home, bring it back to family, bring it back to relationships, bring it back to your own body and how you treat yourself. Think cosmically, act locally. I'm Rick Levine. Peace to all of you through these rock and roll times. I will be checking in with you in the mid-month update, and I'll see many of you then, and the rest of you on the first of the month, and possibly on a live broadcast on the first Friday night of September. That's it for now. I'm out of here.